Hey nerds, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to Growers Daily, your daily dose of ecological farming insight. It is Tuesday, April 1st, 2025, and today we're going to talk about asparagus in the market garden and why we don't see that particular crop a whole lot, navigating the last frost date, and what to do when you don't have access to epic amounts of good compost for mulching. So let's do it. Well, all right. Happy April, everyone. I think that's something that people say, I think. This feels like the month that here in Kentucky definitely marks the beginning of the growing season. We are not out of the woods yet in terms of cold. I see redbud winter in the forecast. Plus, I still at least have dogwood and blackberry winter to go, which is one of my favorite old-timer things that states we always get at least one cold snap around each of the blossoms of those trees/shrubs. That's a hard set of words to say. Redbud, dogwood, and blackberry winters. Though some old timers like to add a locust winter in there as well for a late one, which I got to be honest, sometimes is spot on. For me, I expect two more good frosts, which would be dogwood and blackberry winter, after the one in the forecast for early next week. Maybe there will be another one coming at the beginning of May as well. Then it's off to the races, to use a little Kentucky Derby humor. That is not at all funny. Anyway, today I thought I would kick off the show talking a bit about navigating those last frost dates and how to responsibly plan and plant around them, because it happens every year. We get a nice warm spell in March and even April, and people get itching to get their gardens established without accounting for the inevitable cold that is still coming. Not that you can't plant sensitive crops in April, just that you cannot plant sensitive crops and not also protect them. Fun fact, planting too early is the original source of April Fools. Like we were the fools. Okay, it's not that, but it totally could be. So for us, our last chance of frost is really May 12th. I used to say it was May 10th, but then 2020 happened where we hit 24 degrees Fahrenheit, which is like -4 Celsius on May 12th for a fun little punctuation to the pandemic. And I had to revise that May 10th date. To be sure, some years it barely frosts at all in April and then frosts in May, or some years no frost at all through either month. Or other years, we even get like 6 inches of snow in April, but also multiple days near 80 degrees, like tomorrow, which is like 26.6 degrees Celsius, or definitely t-shirt weather. You just never know. But what we do know is that it is possible that we can get medium hard frost and or snow, so everything has to be planted with that possibility in mind. Hope for the best, plan for the worst. That's kind of like farming's motto. So no gambling. Farming and gardening is already gambling enough as it is. No need to make it any worse. We can't be just throwing stuff in the ground and hoping that it will survive, because it won't always. Crops that can get through a light frost are things like spinach and lettuce, tiny carrots, peas, tiny beets, and onions. Most everything else I like to protect with row cover just in case, and like I've talked about with kale, and like I will talk about with other crops that are biennials, if they believe they've gone through a winter in the spring, then they will bolt, which is not great. This is, of course, highly obnoxious because on those hot days, you will have to uncover those crops so they don't burn up. But even things like kale that are cold hardy, I prefer to not take any chances there so as not to risk bolting. Row cover in most cases should not be touching the plants, or the frost will burn the tips, so some sort of hoops are a good idea. The row cover also has to be held down to protect from the wind, just ripping it up and throwing it around. There are different mechanisms for doing that, for holding the row cover down, such as sandbags, to rocks, to even specialized hoops like the Lowcat low tunnels for they sell over there at Neversink Farm Tools. I've not tried those yet, but they certainly look cleaner and tidier than literally everything else I've tried, where you effectively tie the row cover down to the hoops that have these like sort of pseudo eye hooks on the bottoms. The one issue I foresee with that, though, is that the amount of bending over required is not nothing. I mean, it's already a lot of bending over putting hoops in, and in this case, you'd have to bend over twice as much. But I do like the design. I've also seen growers who place slightly longer hoop, like kind of over top. So they put one on the bottom and then they put two over top. It kind of has a similar effect of just locking the row cover down. I'm doubting those will have quite the same level of wind resistance, but may enjoy less bending over, which is nice. So anyway, that covering not only protects the plants from frost and pests, but traps in the warmth and will encourage the plants to grow. As for the more cold-sensitive crops, unless they are growing in a tunnel, there is very little incentive to plant them early in the field, even under frost protection, because the ground temperature is so low, it will make anything that's like a heat-loving crop like tomatoes or whatever more susceptible to diseases and pests. For most growers, even professional ones, holding off until you are closer to or past that last frost date to plant cucumber or tomato plants or whatever, or peppers or eggplant, any of that sort of stuff, is generally something that will serve you well in the season. Just hold off. In fact, even then, depending on the weather, I will cover frost-sensitive crops just to get them a little bit more heat going through that May month after the last chance of frost, where, sure, maybe it won't frost in May, but it can certainly, and often does, get quite cold. Also, sometimes it just gets quite hot. This job is clearly totally normal. I'm sure, Bed Bath & Beyond has similar issues, so I shouldn't complain too much. Anyway, those are just some thoughts on navigating the last chance of frost and planting in the field. Next up, let's change course a bit and hear from a crop that does not care about your frost dates so much, BRB. Today's episode is brought to you by Rimmel Greenhouses.
Whether it's tomatoes to market, flowers in the spring, or your family's harvest, growing in a greenhouse protected from the weather provides the right environment that you need for a harvest that you can count on. Rimmel greenhouses are designed for durability and offer the quality that you need to grow productively year-round. Visit rimmelgreenhouses.com to get a quote today.
If I may editorialize for a second, I own a Rimmel tunnel. I love it. We built it ourselves, and I really appreciated the quality of the tunnel as well as the customer service we received in the process, so make sure to check them out. If you, the listener, are enjoying this content, getting even a small amount of value from it, consider supporting our work over at patreon.com/no-till-growers. I will try to get to questions from everywhere that questions come in, but I will always get to your Patreon questions. Now, today's Patreon question comes from Patreon member Lee Kosub, who succinctly asks, quote, asparagus in the market garden? Is this a thing? If so, how? Thank you, Farmer Jesse. You are a true gem, end quote. Okay, so, thank you, Lee. So the short answer is that yes, asparagus can be a great crop for market gardeners, sort of. So let's back up and talk about asparagus, because although I absolutely love the stuff, it's delicious, the reason you don't see more of it in the market gardens is basically just because the establishment period is just so dang long, and that it's hard to use those asparagus beds for anything but asparagus, with some exceptions that we will get to. First, asparagus is started primarily from crowns, though seeds can be used. It just takes, like an extra year. Once the crowns are planted, the asparagus takes about 3 to 4 years to establish. If you start harvesting it too soon, however, you will set it back or potentially kill the crown. And you don't really want to challenge it too much with competition in that period of time, just to ensure it gets good roots established and adequate sunlight. Then, depending on your climate, you may not really see sufficient asparagus yields until year 4 or 5. Our friend Dan Brisebois, in fact, did a good breakdown of asparagus that I'll also link in the show notes, per usual, talking about what to expect when you plant asparagus and asparagus profitability. This should not be super surprising, but it is not spectacularly profitable, especially if you have to wait 4 years or so to make a dime off of it. So beyond just the amount of time it takes to establish, profitability is another reason you don't see a lot of market gardeners using it. They don't have a lot of bed space to give it, and then giving up multiple or several beds for multiple years and managing the weeds in those beds through that time is a tall task on intensive small acreage, especially when it does not bring a large return for many years, even after it starts producing. So the next question would be, okay, can I grow something else while I wait for the asparagus to be worth a hoot? And the answer is maybe, but not immediately. Asparagus does make an okay interplanting crop once established, so after that 2 or 3 year period, especially beside or underneath something like fruit trees. You would not want to interplant it too heavily in the first couple of years while it's getting established, but once it's there, you could start working with intercropping more crops, especially slower deciduous tree crops that are not fully leafed out or until later in the asparagus season. One study with asparagus and olive orchards found that intercropping the two can lead to 50% more income and more income security, though labor and costs also rose, obviously, so that would have to be accounted for. I know Mark Shepard has talked a lot about alley cropping with asparagus between chestnut trees. It isn't totally unreasonable to think that these kinds of perennial crops can be established together and work off of one another. Annual crops can work too, which I'm sure is probably what most people are more curious about. I've heard a lot of people interplanting strawberries and herbs with them. Strawberries, I'm a little bit less, just in terms of the timing, it doesn't make as much sense because strawberries are more like a May crop, and that's like right after asparagus is done producing. So the competition there might be a little bit heavy, but it may work in certain situations, certain climates. And again, it's not one I've done. I don't grow a ton of asparagus, and we just have a family patch, but we have never interplanted with them just because they are still too young since we've planted them. I want them to get good and established before we start getting to the interplanting phase. But could see planting something simple with them that would mostly stay below the ferns, such as winter squash, maybe. Perhaps, though, to be clear, again, I've not tried that pairing. I'm just speculating here. Winter-killed cover crops are also one that I could see working really well to help with the fertility and the mulch going into the spring. Or maybe if I can keep those beds clean enough, having some lettuce crops and using the asparagus ferns as shade wouldn't be a bad idea. It's something I'd like to play with, but again, for all the reasons I just stated, it's not something that we have even focused on very much in our garden. Anyway, what I do believe you will start seeing more of in the coming years is that the sort of wave of market gardeners who joined the farming movement in the late aughts, like I did, or in the early teens. Many of those growers are pretty well established at this point and have taken time to set up their businesses. And finally, somewhere along the way, had the capacity and time to start planning for planting longer term projects like asparagus. To me, this is not generally a crop to start a garden business with. It's a plant to, maybe in like year 3 or year 5, when you have your systems down, your market down, that's when you'd kind of start focusing on something like asparagus. Not that it can't be done, for sure, it can definitely be done, but I find it's easier to plan to add complicated long-term projects to an existing system than to try and maintain them while you're getting your system established. With perennial crops, people often want to plant them as soon as they get their land, but I feel like these things often get rushed just because they take so long to start producing, and then they get neglected because it's triage, right? You're just trying to make sure you get through your season, and you kind of end up letting your perennials go. In my mind, the best way to have success with perennial crops is to take the time to plan them out, learn the land, and investigate the varieties that you may or may not work in your context, in your region, especially with something low growing like asparagus, where the upfront cost is high and the weed control must be managed well. Got to play that one smart. Anyway, thoughts on asparagus yourselves? Let us know. Otherwise, up next, we're going to talk about no-till with no compost or light compost. You get the idea. Be right back. Today's episode is also brought to you by Farmhand. Newsletters, right? A necessary evil for CSA farmers. Join Farmhand and real CSA farmers on April 11th for a free digital workshop where they'll share strategies they use to turn their newsletters into powerful sales tools. Get the secrets and go-to templates for success when you register for the free workshop today at farmhand.partners/newsletter. That's farmhand.partners/newsletter. And I'll put the link in the show notes. All right, back to the show. All right, so there are many ways to promote ecological low or no-till agriculture that are not just layering a thick layer of compost and then planting into that. And in fact, depending on the quality of that compost and your context, those other methods may even be better for some growers. Certainly, it is hard to beat the simplicity, not to mention the aesthetic loveliness, of deep compost mulching. But let's just talk about some of the other ways you can still run a reasonably healthy, robust, ecologically minded garden without compost mulching, because not everyone has access to large amounts of compost. Not everyone has money for that amount of compost. Deep compost mulching doesn't make sense for all growers. So the first thing is that you still have to create a plantable surface one way or another. If you cover an area with enough mulch for long enough, or a tarp for long enough, it will clear itself of sod or whatever is there. And a lot of times with deep compost mulching, people will lay down cardboard, cover that with compost, and then wait a short while, if at all, before planting. This, to be sure, does not always have good results depending on the compost quality. And of course, we've talked about the high nutrient risks in past shows, so that also has to be factored in there. But there's also no real quick, effective version of a plantable bed service without compost that does not involve plowing/tilling, really. I mean, I suppose you could bring in fill dirt, but that comes with its own complications. Anyway, a plantable bed service must still be made, even if you plan to generally rely heavily on mulches to slowly make it over time. By that, I mean just the soil underneath the mulch will slowly get worked up. So that means, indeed, some amount of plowing / tilling or time under mulch, like 4 months minimum, preferably more. Those are really your options for getting the ground started. But like I always say, don't shy away from one-time tillage just because you think it's more ecological. It may not be. The better approach may be to work in some compost and some amendments before starting your fully forever from now on no-till garden. If done right in the beginning, it can create truly good long-term soil health. Once the plantable bed surface part is determined, however, there are indeed other mulches out there in the world that can work just as well, if not better, than compost. The mulch video that we did can be a good intro into their nuances, but some basics to think about are things like naturally you can't sow, say, carrots into hay, but you can use non-sprayed hay whenever you plan to transplant larger crops like tomatoes, peppers, potatoes, etc. Ditto straw, as long as it is not sprayed, which you will just have to ask the supplier if they know. And if they don't know, assume it is. Leaves are a bit more complicated because they are so eager to blow away and are not as eager to allow moisture through them, but they can certainly be used in conjunction with some of these other mulches. Generally use mulches wherever possible, and where it is not as possible, say in areas where you want to direct seed something, just make sure the soil is well protected from erosion. Do very, very light, minimal surface tillage. If you go too deep, it's going to allow for way more erosion. So if you're just raking or just scuffing up the top surface, even using something like a tilter, you're less likely to run into heavy amounts of erosion. In deep compost mulch systems, fertility is part of the system. Obviously, it's a bunch of compost. Rarely are you having to add any additional fertility treatments when the base growing layer is, like a rich compost base. And to be sure, I firmly believe, because the science tends to back it up, that every garden and farm benefits from at least a small amount of good compost. And at very least, you should be making some of your own anyway, because you're going to have some organic waste, even if just from your kitchen. However, what I like when good compost doesn't exist are the high protein amendments like alfalfa meal. I don't use things like blood meal as much, only because critters will dig into the garden if it smells like blood or fish or food or whatever. But I like the organic alfalfa meal as an amendment. I should naturally emphasize that amendments should largely be added under the guidance of an agronomist or soil, or following your soil test. Alfalfa meal, I feel less concerned about because the nutrients are generally like 201 and nothing wildly off the charts. I mean, it's obviously a legume and not a grass, but it's just basically like ground up grass clippings, just like really, really good grass clippings. But when you get into fish meals and blood meals and even things like peanut meals, which be careful with that stuff in case in case of like peanut allergies in your customer base. But definitely if you'll be utilizing any rock minerals to replace the fertility element of compost, that's when you need to be increasingly more thoughtful about how you use it and consult an agronomist. I should also say that maybe you have some compost, but not a ton of compost, and can do a light layer as a mulch. That is fine too. I think a light compost mulching gets overlooked sometimes, but as I often say, the depth of your mulch layer is directly proportional to your weed issues. The less mulch, the more weeds. So get the weeds in check before relying on just a thin layer of any sort of mulch. Cover crops are an additional mulching and or fertility option that can be incorporated into non-compost mulching systems, which are probably too much to go into individually here, but no doubt more on specific cover crops in due time. And we've done lots of videos on cover crops, which you can follow, which I will post maybe 1 or 2 in the show notes. I think when it comes time to using systems that are not reliant on compost, the biggest takeaway for me is just making the system as dynamic as you can, or as makes sense for you. Separate the crops that can be mulched with thick carbonaceous mulches from those that can't, like the ones that can't would be like arugula and carrots and direct seeded stuff. Although it's more combined now that we've shrunk our gardens. For years, we managed 4 large plots entirely different from our main plots because we put all of our long season crops like potatoes and popcorn and garlic and that sort of stuff in those long season plots and managed them with hay and cover crops and various combinations, while in the other system, we managed that more with compost mulches and things like alfalfa meal. Sometimes, depending on the crops that you're growing, systems just have to be dynamic like that. If you're going to do direct seeded crops and things like sweet potatoes or something, you probably don't have to do those in the same place under the same conditions. Anyway, those are some thoughts. Otherwise, I'm going to wrap it up there. Don't forget, we are now officially a 501c3, so donations are tax deductible and greatly appreciated. Please make sure to like and subscribe and or follow wherever you are getting this podcast. That's an easy way to help us out. Enormous thank you to all of our show sponsors. Huge shouts to Willie Breeding for the theme music and the team at No Till Growers, including our new editor, Mike. Also, shouts to Epidemic Sound for the background music that you can hear. You and me. Pick up a copy of the Living Soil Handbook or the Seed Farmer at no-tillgrowers.com to support our work. Big thank you to everyone over at patreon.com/no-tillgrowers, where at a certain level, or if you just bump up from one level to another, or sign up in the month of March, you get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs today to Home, Home, Home. That is our solo today. Home is actually, this is a great novel. This is about a poet who lived in Minnesota in the late 90s and wrote hopeful poetry about what life would be like after Y2K, when we would maintain a more simplified, slower, more connections-based society, something that was more stable and easier to protect. And then on January 1st, they read the headline in their local paper that read, Y2K, we're okay. And they thought, are we though? Which incidentally became the title of their first poem that they ever sold to a local zine and sparked its own little Back to the Land movement. It was like 4 people, but I mean, it was something. So yeah. Anyway, thanks for watching and or listening. We will see you tomorrow for Wednesday, middle of the week. Here we go. Bye.